And hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Arkansas Week. Believe it or not, and you had best believe it, primary election day is just around the corner in Arkansas, just a couple of weeks away. Both parties have candidates for statewide and district offices, and there are also some rather interesting campaigns underway for seats in the General Assembly, the Senate in particular. And for the first time, a political party in Arkansas is permitting only its duly registered faithful, or perhaps newly registered faithful, to cast ballots. On board in this edition is some old friends. Hal Bass, emeritus professor of political science at Ouachita Baptist University, Republican consultant Richard Bearden, independent journalist Steve Brawner, and with a bit of blue in his background, Jay Barth of the political science staff at Hendrix College, and thanks to everybody for coming in. Hal, Sir Hal of the long view, where's Arkansas right now compared to the rest of the nation, or is it of a piece with the rest of the nation?
I think we are more in sync with the rest of the nation than we were certainly a generation ago. I think one of the major effects of the party sorting and the polarization that has occurred over the last few decades has been to end traditional parochialism and exceptionalism around the country and give us much more similar circumstances across the board. Rural voters, north or south, east or west. Urban voters, north or south, east and west. Educated, uneducated. Seems like there's more uniformity across the categories and less in terms of location than was back in the day.
Yeah. Richard?
Totally agree. I was in Virginia 2 years ago for a trip to historic sites up there. Virginia is a very purple state. You would not have known that in rural Virginia. Red as all get up. No different than northeast Arkansas, northwest Arkansas. You get to Richmond, different story. So same here. Pulaski County, Little Rock, very blue. Fayetteville and pockets, maybe Eureka Springs, but the rest of the state, pretty solid red. So I totally agree that it's really a urban versus rural, East Coast versus the middle of America right now.
Yeah. Steve?
And that makes the primary elections really potentially more interesting than the general election, because the general election, we know who's going to win. Republicans are going to win in most of the places that Republicans win, and Democrats are going to win in the few places that they still win. And that's what's going to happen.
Let's be fair and balanced now.
That's just the way it is. I don't think that's even. You can look at the national trends that are occurring. You know, supposedly this is going to be a midterm election where the president's party loses seats in the House. That kind of thing is not going to happen in Arkansas. You might see a small turnover in the state legislature, 1 or 2 seats, but not much. We can pretty much predict we can game out how this is going to happen for much of the season.
Yeah, Jay Barth.
Yeah, I think that totally agree that we've become very nationalized, but that's what makes party primaries super interesting, because that's where the real battles occur, right? We've got really competitive primaries on both sides across the state, both in terms of county offices, as well as state legislative seats. And I think that's really where the action is. And so in many ways, you know, we're back to the 1970s in a lot of ways, and that the true action is in terms of who wins or which party represents is going to be happening in the next few weeks.
Yeah, really not a November a matter at all. Well, let's stay with Jay for just a second. What, as you see it, Jay, you would not dispute, I don't suppose, that this rural-urban split in American politics, certainly in Arkansas politics, it seems ever more pronounced.
Yeah, and it's, I think, reinforced in Arkansas because of the education gap that exists in the state, is the correlation between rurality and relatively low college-going rates and urbanity and suburban little Arkansas, where you have higher rates of education. And so that really locks in that urban-rural split. So I think it's both an urban-rural mindset difference, but then it's also some of these key demographic differences that get reinforced, especially in Arkansas, with a little bit of an exception in terms of race, where race voters of color, of course, show themselves both in urban and rural Arkansas.
Yeah, well,
in the Delta.
Yeah, of course, incumbency is an overwhelming factor. So let's kind of run the races. We have spirited primaries. Excuse me, and for the U.S. Senate race, for example, Mr. Cotton, plainly, Steve, the odds-on favorite for renomination, and despite a very spirited campaign thus far by Ms. Schaffner, I would say he's still the favorite.
Right, the action right now is in the primary side of it.
Yeah.
He does not have, he has only token opposition in the primaries. Same really for the other candidates, the other incumbents. Interesting race over in the Democratic side for the Senate between Ethan Dunbar and Hallie Schaffner. Hallie Schaffner has come to the place where, I mean, she is running a professional campaign with fundraising, with people. She has apparent some national support, or at least she's raising money like she is. Ethan Dunbar has not even filed a financial report. That says something, but we still have to have the election, and we'll see who wins on March 3rd.
Hal, she has plainly energized the traditional Democratic base.
Certainly, and I think one reason is, and a lot of what we were saying earlier, she does come from a rural background. She's got a farming family heritage there, and it seems to me she's trying to restore a Democratic presence in the rural areas. It's been
Kind of that
largely
agrarian
lacking.
sort of thing. Richard?
Well, I just say it's uphill battle. I looked up, I think Senator Cotton's got $9.5 million. She has raised $1 million, which is an impressive number. We pulled some numbers from a race the other day. So this was in Clay County. Clay County, you know, a cornerstone at one time of sort of Democrat politics.
Up northeast, extreme
Northeast
corner,
Arkansas.
yeah.
Jonesboro, again, longtime key piece for Democrat turnout. And 1.8 million registered voters in the state, only 300,000 register specifically by party. But in that area, when we pulled traditional primary voters, consistent primary voters, Republican versus Democrat, it was an 8-to-1 split, Republican to Democrat. Again, this is some of the counties that Nick Wilson used to represent, very key, powerful member of the Senate. So, you know, the one thing I would say is, again, it has just completely flipped the rural part of the state. And when that flip took place, county judges, county sheriffs, county clerks, eventually, since the mid-2000 teens, have all become Republican. All those primaries we're talking about at the local level are all in the Republican side. So I think while we will...
courts.
That's right, all the way down, city councils in some cases. So there will be some spirited primaries. I think in the end, I don't know that any of our federal delegation will change.
All right. Looking down the road, the governor would seem to be in fairly good shape, at least in terms of November. But she has an interesting situation. Let's go ahead and skip to the General Assembly. It's an interesting situation, some of her choices. Governors have always, in my experience anyway, subtly made a preference known in primaries. For the last two administrations, well, actually three, the governors have been pretty overtly made overt endorsements in there. And Richard, this case this time.
It is. I think, you know, let's maybe start in the River Valley. You had Dunn versus Simon. The governor did not play as strong in that race. You had Wade Dunn ran a strictly anti-prison campaign. That was really his only issue up there. Almost sort of an angry campaign, if you will. He leads in the primary, loses nearly 2-to-1 in the runoff. Why is that? I think part of it is Simon did run a really textbook campaign. He had mail, he had radio, he had door-to-door campaigns. But I also think he said, there are disagreements I may have on this prison. There are other things I find good common cause with the governor. And so I think for her, that was probably a big win without being too deep into it. Some of these other races, you know, she's a little more open in her preference. We'll see. Each of those races, the King race, the Caldwell race, and the race up in Northeast Arkansas with Blake Johnson, each of those are very specific to those voters too. So, you know, I don't know that the governor is going to be the key factor in every one of those, but she certainly has a deep interest in where those races turn out.
Well, and Steve Brawner, it's because parts of her legislative program in the next session, or at least in the foreseeable future, could be profoundly affected by the outcome of this season.
The prison being the obvious one. She's
First one, yeah.
failed 5 votes in the past session. Senator King is obviously a major opponent and often contrarian anyway. So not surprising that she has poured $7,000 from her PAC into his opponent's campaign. More surprising is probably her support of or her opposition to Senator Ronald Caldwell from Wynn, not a bomb thrower, but against the prison. And so she has thrown all of her, another $7,000 in support of his opponent, Trey Bohannon. Senator Caldwell has announced his intention to run for Senate President Pro Tem. If he wins the election and then wins that position, that'll be an interesting dynamic. In politics, you must have a short memory, and so they would presumably, if that all works out that way, they would do fine. But she definitely has thrown her support against two opponents of 2 incumbent Republican senators.
Well, her choice, it would appear, in Senator Johnson, as Richard mentioned a minute ago, that race up there in Clay County and that surrounding area. The demographics would seem to favor the senator's opponent.
You know, I think
The geography of the demographics of that district.
it strikes me that the governor's goal, what it appears to be, to try to stack the deck for the policy agenda going forward. What remains to be seen, as Richard noted, was whether the voters in the primary are going to be motivated by that particular issue or more district-specific issues and candidate-specific issues.
No, I completely agree. It's going to be 3 now very distinct races. Blake Johnson, chairman of the Insurance and Commerce Commission, very powerful commission, a committee in the legislature. Wooldridge, of course, is a legacy. His father was a state senator years before. They've got deep ties. But it could really come down to Greene County versus Clay County. Right now, more people live in Greene County. So I think in that one, it may not be the deep, who's going to be the president pro tem of the Senate. It may be more, do we want somebody from this county versus that county? So I think some of these, again, will play subtly. It'll really just come down to, you like your state senator or do you not like your state senator?
Geography over ideology, in other words.
Yes.
Yeah, Jay Barth.
Yeah, I'm super interested in all these races for different reasons, but the special election in District 26, that was where the Republican runoff just happened. I think clearly the Republican, Brad Simon's going to win that race, but there is a little bit of an experiment going on in that Adam Watson, who founded that gravel and grit group that has been kind of the grassroots opposition to prison, is running as an independent. And there's some indication, of course, that the loser of that runoff is not supportive of Brad. He explicitly said so. Said he was not supporting the Brad Simon. And it's kind of an interesting experiment in how much the Democratic brand is costing candidates in rural Arkansas. Is if this independent candidate, overperforms significantly, we may start to see that experiment or other candidates in rural Arkansas who are more progressive on issues run as independents rather than as Republicans, as we've seen in some U.S. Senate races like in Nebraska, in South Dakota, where the Democratic brand is a really challenged brand at this stage of the game.
Downright toxic. Let's go to Hal Bass here because this is something we're all interested in, and that is the closed primary this year.
Sure.
What effect? How's this going to affect stuff?
We'll see. In terms of why the change, it's a normal response of a political party organization to want to have relative control over the most precious thing it has to bestow, and that is the party nomination. I think there is a fear of crossover voting and rating opportunities, but I think that fear is very much overstated. There's simply not enough registered Democrats. Richard gave the statistics just a moment ago to be affected by this, statewide at any rate. I think the really more interesting question is the symbolic as opposed to the substantive significance of this change. And it strikes me, at least speculatively, that what we may be seeing is the majority Republican Party comfortable with the magnitude of its electoral coalition and not particularly interested in conversion at the margins, more focusing on mobilization of voters as opposed to converting, and not seeing the advantage that they benefited from in recent decades in their rise in terms of allowing Democrats to participate.
Yeah. Richard, turnout?
No, completely agree. And look, I was the executive director of the state party back in the late 1990s when it was the exact opposite, as Jay mentioned, in the 70s. You know, if you won the primary as a Democrat, you were more than likely going to win the general election. In fact, you always won. The joke back in the 90s and the 80s even, you know, if you were chairman of the Republican Party and we didn't have a candidate, you had to run, because especially for governor. So Ken Kuhn and Lynn Blaylock, you know, were very token candidates for governor because you had to garner 3% of the vote. I think, again, what has happened in rural Arkansas, so not just Benton County and Washington County, but in, you know, Polk County and in Sevier County, those local elected officials at some point in the mid 2000s simply flipped party registration, sometimes right before the election, sometimes right after the election. They were elected as a Democrat and switched party. And I think, you know, Republican party officials at some point said, hey, we need to make sure that only ideological Republicans are voting in these races. So, you know, I think this was the first election in which they sort of followed the state law that was passed to check which primary you'd voted in. So again, 1.8 million voters, only 300,000 actually have an R by their name. The rest of them are really being sort of tagged out, if you will, by which primary they voted in last. So we'll see what the experiment.
Yeah. Steve?
But you can vote in the Republican primary unless you are a registered Democrat.
Yeah.
That is the only group that's excluded. Even members of the other parties, there's 700 libertarians that can vote in the Republican primary, no questions asked. There's a couple hundred Green Party members. There is one other. I don't know who it is, but one contrarian other in this entire state is on another party. So 4.8% of the state is excluded from the Republican primaries. Those are registered Democrats. Everybody else, 87% of us are optional. We aren't in any party, so, or at least technically. So that's who's excluded is the Democrats.
Yeah. Jay Barth, should we look to this new rule to shape our politics much?
Yeah, I'm a little worried about it, not because of the substantive outcomes. I think, as was said, I think it's just going to lead to a lot of confusion, especially this first time out. And I think just for those of us who care deeply about civic engagement and people having kind of an open door to participate, I think it sends some signals about a door being partially closed. I think there's going to be some confusion, probably most likely in some of the rural counties where there are still some older registered Democrats going back to the day before the 1990s, as Richard said, where the action was on the Democratic side. So I think that's going to be the interesting story of the first week, is how much of this confusion there is.
Yeah, we need to touch on a couple of congressional districts that have primaries, and that's the 2nd and the 4th. Steve, any thoughts on that?
Well,
we've got incumbents, of course, in both.
it's the 2nd with Representative French Hill and the 4th with Representative Bruce Westerman as a Democratic primary. Not much to, I mean, it would be hard to imagine Representative Hill losing. In fact, he's just had recently a big win in the House, passing banking home ownership reform.
Yeah.
So these are not competitive at this point. And in the 4th district, that's a Democratic primary for the right to face a very difficult to beat opponent. So hard to get excited about the congressional primaries. The action is going to be some state races. The Secretary of State would be kind of interesting in the Republican primary, land commissioner, and then the state Senate races are really the most interesting races on the ballot.
Yeah. Well, let's mention Secretary of State, because it's could be a very, very, very important office, more than just a caretaker. Richard?
Three candidates, probably two that will
more
run
than
a
an
campaign.
administrative, I should say, office. Yeah.
Absolutely. Petition counting and ballot access in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You know, state senator, well-known, longtime state senator, Kim Hammer, and then you've got a county judge down in Miller County they're running. But still, a very low information race. I don't think I've gotten much information on either of those candidates. So we'll see in the last month going in, you know, one candidate's going to have county judge, the other's going to have state senator, the other's just going to be blank name. And some of those areas where there's not a lot of information, it's sometimes people eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and they pick the first guy on the ballot. So I actually think those are both wide open. That's a wide open race that, you know, we may know on election night what the turnout depends where the turnout is, Central Arkansas versus South Arkansas, who the winner is. But no clear winner right now today, I don't
Hal,
think.
thoughts on that?
I think that Secretary of State's race in the Republican side does indicate kind of the factional divisions within the Arkansas Republican Party these days. And that you've got more of an old traditional economic-based Republican. Then you've got the more office-holding element. You've got the more MAGA type. I think the totals will give us some sense of where the balance of power is within the Republican Party, better than any other race that's on the ballot this time around. Going back to the congressional races, I think the issue there is what kind of turnout do the Democrats get in their primary, and what it can tell us about what to look forward to in the fall. It's not the outcome that's going to matter. It's can the Democrats lower the margins here as an indication of a wave across the country.
Yeah. And this, if we have forever buried, or at least for the foreseeable future, buried Speaker O'Neill's admonition that all politics is local, if it's all national now. Jay Barth, there would seem to be the incumbent president and his administration have some pretty anemic ratings right now. A lot of controversy out of Washington, a lot of disputatious dialogue up there. Is any of this filtering down? Could any of this have any measurable impact on politics in Arkansas? Jay.
I think in general, no. I think that we are seeing Republican candidates talking about the president a little bit less this year than in previous the last few cycles. I think the Democratic base is pretty fired up generally, but it's a small base, as has already been said. I think the one place where it might matter is this district special election for District 70, House seat in North Little Rock. It was the closest House seat out there 2 years ago. We have a repeat Democrat running against a new Republican, because obviously that seat is open. And I do think that that's the one place where you might have some impact of some of these national patterns at the local level in Arkansas. But that's a maybe, because I think that's going to also have personality and local issues surrounding it as well. I do think the one thing that we're going to see, going back to turnout, we're going to see a little bit of a checkerboard story in terms of turnout. We're going to see some counties where turnout's pretty relatively high, where there's just a lot of local action. And then we're going to see counties, I think, where there's just abysmal turnout because there's so little going on at the local level.
Yeah, Richard, Hal mentioned this a second ago, and that the tensions may be within the Republican Party as opposed to between the two parties. You've got the hard right MAGA base and what has been the more mainstream Republican.
Look, let's just use the state Senate as sort of a microcosm of where we are. You may remember several years ago there was the Brotherhood, a combination of Republican and Democrat senators that sort of worked against the power base, if you will, to create a new power base. There are only 6 Democrat senators in the state Senate. So really the power struggle now is between senators that are more supportive of the governor's policies and some senators that maybe don't agree as much on some key pieces to them that they don't want to be in solidarity with the governor. That's really what these, I think, remaining 3 or 4 Senate seats out there are going to be about. It's really not going to be about whether the President Trump's right or wrong on immigration or anything else. It's going to be about, again, local issues and where maybe their senator stands on some of the governor's key points, the LEARNS Act and the prison. I don't necessarily know if Ron Caldwell wins. It's a rejection of everything the governor's for, but it will certainly solidify where the state is, I think, and our party is in terms of this coalition in the Senate and the legislature.
Yeah, Steve, we got about 30 seconds. You want it?
I think currently, right now, if there's a power struggle, it's not a 50-50 split. Right now, the legislature is mostly pro-Sanders at this point.
Yeah.
So it depends on how big it gets, the opposition, and what it will be able to stop, and also just how the fact that Governor Sanders will be in her second term the next time that they meet in the regular session, how that dynamic will change things, because over time, a governor's power begins to wane as they're in there a longer period.
Yeah, always. All right, gentlemen, thank you for coming in. That does it for us this week. Bass, Brawner, Bearden, and Barth, LLC. Come back soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, as always, for watching, and we'll see you next week.